Good evening, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Sorry about that slight delay. I'm Lisa Carrico, Director of Family and Veteran Programs for the Missouri Humanities. We are a member-supported organization, and our mission is dedicated to enriching lives and strengthening communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Thank you for joining our first program in our Environmental Humanities series, Missouri's Natural Environment, 200 Years and Beyond. To coincide with our state's bicentennial, we will host several programs to explore Missouri's natural landscape and how it shapes our state's identity, how Missourians have shaped and been shaped by this landscape, and the role we have in utilizing and caring for our lands. I'm excited to introduce Forest and Farms and our guest speakers for tonight. In this program, we will explore the transformation of the Missouri River Valley from lush bottomland forests to fertile farmland and efforts to reforest the land along the Cady Trail. Whether you're watching on Zoom or Facebook Live, we invite you to be a part of the conversation. If you're on Facebook, please let us know you're watching by asking questions and leaving comments. If you're on Zoom, feel free to submit questions using the chat or QA feature at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. If you enjoy this program and would like to learn more about Missouri Humanities and upcoming events, please check us out on Facebook or on our website. We also have a membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to member-only events. Joining is easy. Visit mohumanities.org and click Become a Member. At the conclusion of the program, a link to our program survey will pop up on your screen. We'd really appreciate if everyone watching could take a few minutes to provide feedback on tonight's presentation. This feedback helps shape future programs. Before moving on, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements honor a place's Indigenous people and recognize the history that has brought us to where we are today. Missouri Humanities respectfully acknowledges that the land on which we reside has cultural significance for many Native peoples, including the Osage, Oto, Missouri, Sauk and Fox, Iowa, Kansas, Kickapoo, Peoria, Shawnee, Delaware, Pickenshaw, Sioux, and Cherokee. We're ever mindful that these peoples continue a sacred relationship with the lands we occupy, and we recognize and appreciate their integral contributions to the cultural heritage of the state and to our nation's history. To help us better understand the landscape we experience today along the Katy Trail, our first guest, Ken McCarty, will describe the forest that once covered the Missouri River Valley in the 1800s and changes over time. In his presentation, Ken will explore the following questions. Are the environmental conditions the same as once experienced by Indigenous people and early settlers? Are the trees that we see or plant today along the Katy Trail equivalent to those that once grew in our native forest? Ken McCarty is the Director of Natural Resource Management for the Missouri State Parks and currently chairs Missouri's Natural Areas Committee. He has spent his 40-year career studying and promoting Missouri's native natural ecosystems and authored the restoration plan for Confluence Point State Park. He's a two-time Professional Conservationist of the Year recipient from the Missouri Conservation Federation for his work restoring and protecting natural communities. And in 2015, he received the Walter P. Crawford Prairie Professionals of the Year Award. In addition, he received the Missouri Native Plants Society's Arthur Christ Memorial Research Award for contributions to the conservation of the natural biodiversity of Missouri. Take it away, Ken. Ken, I do believe you are muted, so.
Well, I just gave the whole program. There we go.
All right.
So thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone who's here. And to begin, lead off here with this first presentation for the evening, I direct your eyes to the question on the banner. which is, are the trees that we see are planted today along the Katy the equivalent to those that we once grew in our 1800s era native forest? And I will refine that question in the form of, if a goal is replanting trees or restoring segments of the Missouri River's floodplain forest along the Katy, what's our frame of reference? Or, and I'm having trouble advancing. All right. Or in the frame of mind of users, people biking along the trail, any one of you, people who are involved in restoration projects, planting projects, invasive species control project in the modern environment, or driving the fields and farms and forests through the river valley today, seeing what's there now and wondering what was it like in the valley before the pages of history turned. And to address this question, I want to take us first to St. Charles, and I'd like to do so about 200 years ago and build that historical frame of reference. And we're here at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi and the Illinois rivers at about the time of the Louisiana Purchase. It was a time when boats were pulled or poled up the river. It was the era of great explorers and explorations like that of Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike. It was the time famous American naturalists came out to the Great West in this new land, this Louisiana Purchase. And then the GLO first land survey records were made that documented the kinds of trees and landforms and vegetation that occurred across this new land in Missouri, and that opened up the settlement that came after that. These people, for whatever reason they might have come, would make their way to St. Louis. And they would, while at St. Louis, at some point, it seems like from reading what's left behind, almost universally, make a trip to St. Charles, a tiny little village, either by river or by horseback across the high ground in between St. Louis and St. Charles. And at St. Charles, they would follow the high ground easterly towards this confluence area that you can see in either of these maps. And they would go out to the very end of what had to be one of the major sightseeing destinations of this area in that day, because so many people did it and so many people describe standing on that high ground, looking at the far distant bluffs along the Mississippi, Illinois, the entire alluvial plain at that time, about 16 miles long, 8 to 10 miles wide in places. And they, besides admiring it, as the quote says, described it. And while earlier I would have expected in this environment to see a vast, huge floodplain forest in this kind of riverine environment, what they described in the words of Henry Brackenridge was, behold the ocean of prairie with islands at intervals. And he's joined by a whole host of people who came, who saw, who recorded the rich, the extensive prairie that existed across this massive joining of the Illinois, the Missouri with the Mississippi River. And it's universally one of a prairie landscape, not of a forested. Trees existed, but trees were confined to the fringes, the very point of the confluence, a narrow margin along the Missouri Riverside, and an interrupted series along the Mississippi. Some places no trees bordering the Mississippi at all. And this prairie system extended beyond the confluence area well up the Mississippi River Valley. However, it did not extend up the Missouri. And we're going to start traveling up the Missouri. We're going to leave that point of high ground, as hard as it may be. We're going to go back to St. Charles, and we're going to start up the Missouri River Valley. And we're going to look at some of the words and some of our understanding of what these natural communities were. And what was described upriver past St. Charles, moving towards the Gasconade and up towards the Osage, was a very thick forest setting, filling the valleys, in the words of Duke Paul Wilhelm, so rich in various trees and bushes that it was impossible to put the crew on land to pull the boat. The river here, as those of you who know it, is very rigidly and narrowly confined given the volume of water that comes down annually from the precipitation and snow melt in the Rockies in a huge watershed to crowd through this narrow channel and to rise up over its banks robustly and vigorously with much energy across that floodplain, scouring, depositing, altering the course of the river. This is not a prairie setting. It's not a setting where one can find bottomland hardwood trees reaching maturity. It's a land of cottonwoods and sycamores and elms and other kinds of successional sorts of trees that can tolerate lots of sediment, lots of energy, lots of water. Moving further, from the Osage on up towards the Grand, there is recognized that there is variety at points along the river. There is not a river with a forest. There is a series, a suite of forest environments, different kinds that existed in different situations. William Clark noted the low bottoms with the cottonwood and willow versus the high bottoms with ashes and hackberries and basswoods and mulberries. And that's the same thing we get in our modern analysis, is that floodplains are very diverse and variable environments. This became more so moving up the river past the Osage as the valley started to broaden. And as it broadened in different places, we start seeing a reappearance of prairie, small at first, but in a grand way at the mouth of the Grand. Here you have 4 chroniclers of the Lewis and Clark expedition on June 14th, 1804, their first experience with one of the huge river prairies along the Missouri River in the vicinity of the mouth of the Grand. And it was apparently quite a sight. But it brings across a point for this presentation is that the river valley vegetation was highly variable and it responded to geography. We're moving into the glaciated plains, the tallgrass prairie realm. Landform, they tend to be very broad in this area. Extensive backwaters, extensive glacial terraces, related to geology. These kind of settings, you started to see prairie, oak savanna become an element of the river floodplain. Moving further up to the entrance of the Kansas River, the Big Bend at Kansas City, where it turns north and heads for the Iowa line, you see different segments and different sections that were alternately narrow and filled with floodplain forest of certain types, or very broad and expansive. Think Squaw Creek National Wildlife Refuge, Mound City, north of St. Joseph, Missouri. That floodplain is 10 miles across, broad, sweeping backwater overflow channels that were filled historically at this 200 years ago interval with marshes and wet prairies and communities of this type. So highly variable. And there's a model that I want to introduce, is that first and foremost, the river was variable. What was found in terms of vegetation along its length changed from mouth through different segments in response to things like geology, landform, soil types. And these in turn influenced the kinds of vegetation that occurred. And there was a gradient or a transition from the low river to the high across these geographic zones. Next, and I've said it before, there's more than having a floodplain, and that floodplain has its forest. There are very distinct and mutually recognizable, individually recognizable forest and plant community associations that we call natural communities that can be found from one side to the other in a cross section of the floodplain at all these different places. Successional riverfront forest is very different from a mesic bottomland forest in deep silty loams near the valley bottom, which is very different from the open woodland savannas on these extensive clay backwater flats, for example. Recognizing there's different types of forest, one has to imagine there's different settings that is responsible for that. And imagine again, the difference between a high glacial terrace, a well-drained alluvial ridge or natural levee out on the floodplain, a very low, frequently flooded floodway, or the river channel itself, the different kind of substrates and settings that is. And you find that there is a matching of these different landforms and physical environments with the natural communities. For example, oak savanna and flatwoods on the backwater flats and high glacial remnants, very different from the floodplain forest on those frequently flooded low floodplains or the riverfront itself where the cottonwoods and willows predominated. So we see a matching of community types to certain landforms that are common to the river valley. And we can then also recognize that these natural communities have their own discrete assemblage of trees or other kinds of plants that associate with them. That oak savanna or flatwoods on that high backwater glacial terrace might be dominated by swampwhite and burrs, or it might be a flatwoods with pin oaks and pecans. Very different from the mesic bottomland forest on those deep, rich, loamy soils along the river floodplain margin that has these classic bottomland oaks and hickories. That's a very simplified version. There's many ways to make it more complex, but it really here to understand that the variety and the diversity of plant types, including tree types, that is native to the Missouri River floodplain is rich and robust. There are many, many different kinds of trees that relate to these different kinds of settings and these different reaches of the historic Missouri River. But they're not necessarily the entire suite of plants that are native to Missouri, nor are they necessarily the plants that one might find in a list of bottomland hardwood species. And if there's a lesson for what our native environment was along the floodplain of the Missouri that relates to the kinds of restoration projects that we have today or the conservation, is that there is a distinct suite of vegetation that is native to the floodplain itself. And to the question of, do forests, understanding our native forests today, does that have meaning to what we experience today, knowing that so much has changed within the floodplain in terms of flooding patterns, landform, and so forth? And to that, I would say yes. What trees are native to the Missouri River floodplain? It's very clear in looking through some of these what those are. Which trees associate with what forest community? And that's a crucial factor in trying to plan out conservation plans or management plans for existing forests, or for any kinds of the recreations or replantings that one might do. What's the correct floodplain setting for each community, which relates to what trees go where across this floodplain setting, and how important are flood patterns, soils, elevation, and modern tree planting decisions. These are crucial as we think through these, and it's what history in the native form can teach us. And we can see it in a few places. Most of these in their richness and robustness have gone their way. Through different times in the past, but the Missouri Natural Areas Program highlights a few places where you can go and see the richness of species, the very fine-grained mosaic of community patterns that exist in a historic native natural condition, and understand and assemble in your mind how these different pieces fit together, where we match trees to communities and communities to situations at different lengths of a floodplain. And I will leave you with a few good sources for those who wish to explore a little bit more. There are many ways to get at these kinds of information about what our native forests were like. And here's a few particularly good ones. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ken, for your insight on the vegetation history of the river valley. I especially liked seeing the list of areas you can visit to see remnants of the native forest. Our second guest, Dan Burkhardt, is the owner of the Bethlehem Valley Farm and Vineyards and is the co-founder of two St. Louis-based advocacy organizations, the Cady Land Trust and Magnificent Missouri, both established in 2010. The Cady Land Trust mission is to conserve land along the 225-mile Cady Trail State Park, the longest bike path in the United States. And Magnificent Missouri supports land conservation, historic preservation, and economic development with the last 100 miles of the Missouri River Valley. This evening, Dan will provide an overview of the clearing of native bottomland forest and how this made way for today's farms along the Missouri River Valley. He will then introduce a video that will showcase Magnificent Missouri's Trees of Treloar Conservation Project and efforts to reforest areas along the Katy Trail. Dan, take it away.
Well, good evening, all you tree lovers. There's no better place to experience what Ken just talked about than the Cady Trail. The land along the Missouri River is full of interesting places, and there's no ride like on the Cady to see it. The evolution of the river valley west of St. Louis is a fascinating story. And I had the good fortune to work with Ted Jones, who created the Cady Trail in the 1980s. And one of his great dreams for the trail was that it would be a place for people to connect to the Missouri countryside and the history of the region. And our hope today is that the more people understand the past of this area, the more they'll have an interest in conserving it for the future. My wife Connie and I wrote a children's book a couple of years ago that some of you may be familiar with, Growing Up with the River. And that book looked at the environmental and cultural changes from the perspective of 9 generations of children who had grown up along the Missouri River since Lewis and Clark. And our book cover, which I think you can see now, is a painting by Missouri artist Brian Haynes. And it depicts the changes, including the deforesting of the river bottom that we're talking about tonight, that have happened in the last 200 years. You can see on our book cover, we've got steamboats and Native Americans, and we even have an extinct Carolina parakeet carrying an acorn. So the evolution of the Missouri River Valley from a diverse forest that Ken described to agriculture actually began with the harvesting of wood for steamboat fuel in the mid-1800s. The steamboats required massive amounts of fuel for their boilers. An average size steamboat took 35 cords of wood a day, and there were hundreds of them going up and down the Missouri River for years. And to store that wood yards were created that eventually created some of our Missouri River towns. One of these wood yards was called Miller's Landing, and it became the town of New Haven. So fuel harvesting began at the edge of the river, and the cutters worked their way back into the river valley. The unintended consequence of all this wood cutting was that the riverbanks became destabilized and the meandering Missouri moved over the river bottom even more. So it hasn't just been the fuel sources of oil and coal that have created environmental challenges. The steamboat era lasted for only about 30 years, but during that time, large amounts of forest were harvested. And that paved the way for more extensive agriculture, and gradually the rich dirt in the bottoms became extremely productive farmland. Instead of growing trees, it was growing corn and wheat and other crops. Year by year, the farmers removed more and more trees and planted more crops. As the crops increased, the need for them to get to market became more pressing, and that brought the Katy Railroad. Then came the building of levees in the 20s and 30s, and after that, the job was pretty much finished. The forested river bottom had been converted to cropland. So interestingly, there aren't very many photos of what this original river bottom that Ken described looked like. Especially there aren't any aerial photos, but we do have maps and we do have paintings of many artists. If we can display a map of this area that was done in 1892 and then compare it with a look at the river bottom today, it's a really interesting comparison. The map illustrates that the general shape of the river is the same today as it was back in 1892. The bottom map illustrates all of the bends and channels and islands that existed in 1892 between the towns of Berger and Washington. And you can see the big bend in the river in both of the maps, both the map from Apple Maps today that shows that big bend on the left. That's called Pinckney Bend. It's near New Haven. And that bend is still there. The general shape of the river is still there, but you can see that it's lost all of the side channels and islands. And it's much more constricted than it was. That's good for agriculture, but bad for the forests that once grew here. So with this context for the past, we want you and others who visit the trail to think about the future and think what it might look like with the organized tree planting efforts that Meredith is going to tell you about in the next segment. Some of you may be familiar with the Treloar trailhead. That's about an hour west of St. Louis on the trail. We had the opportunity to establish a small native tree planting there, a little arboretum directly across from the trailhead. And that trailhead is historic for many reasons. It has a grain elevator that used to ship some of that grain that replaced the trees in the river bottom by rail. So we hope that this place turns into an area where people can engage with tree planting, engage with the project that Meredith's going to talk about. And now I'd like to show you a short 3-minute film clip of the creation of the trees of Treloar. And we hope that some of you have a chance to get out and visit it this spring or summer.
Today we're in one of the most beautiful parts of Missouri along the Cady Trail in the Missouri River Valley. And this place is special for a lot of reasons. It's got a lot of history and it's got a beautiful landscape. We're overlooking thousands of acres of river bottom fields, and the Cady Trail is one of Missouri's and the country's greatest assets. And it's not just a trail, it's a state park. And that's what we're here doing today, is trying to make a state park a little more interesting and a little better and a little more educational for people. What we want to do along the Cady Trail is not only give people a place for recreation, but a place for education and conservation. And so today we're standing in front of a lot that used to be an old building that had been a part of this community for over 100 years. But it had fallen into bad disrepair, and as much as we like to conserve and preserve things, we had to take it down. But it's directly across from the Cady Trail trailhead in Treloar, Missouri, and it offers a great place to teach people about the beauty and the diversity of Missouri river bottom trees. And so today we're here to begin a planting of some beautiful trees of all kinds.
We are donating mostly native trees. The American smoke tree is probably one of the most beautiful fall colors that you'll see. We've donated pecan, a hackberry, sugarberry.
Our champion that's going to be right out front and center is a bur oak. And near Columbia, the largest bur oak in the United States is the McBain bur oak. And that was one of Dan and I's favorites for the last 30 years, 40 years. So we're trying to mimic that native situation all along the Cady Trail with planting some McBain bur oaks, but we have a larger one from Pea Ridge that we can make a real statement here in Treloar. So it's very locally grown native tree with the best broad canopy. So we're going to put some bottomland trees. We're going to put some native fruit-bearing trees to bring the wildlife in that has kind of been lost in a little urban spot. The pioneers and the natives that came through here originally, and indigenous folks, they got a lot of fruit from a lot of native trees along this corridor of the river. We have persimmon, we have pawpaw grove started, and we will also have serviceberry, some of the best fruit-bearing trees to bring the wildlife, and humans can eat all those same things.
So it's just an excellent example of what grows along this corridor, and it'll be a neat interpretive opportunity for people to come see, enjoy, and then they'll be able to identify what they're seeing along the trail.
Long term, our goal is to reforest areas between here and St. Charles along the Cady Trail and the Missouri River. Before the Missouri River was channelized and before the river bottom was used for agriculture, it was filled with trees just like we're planting here today. It was filled with oaks and hackberries and sycamores and all kinds of fruiting trees. Lewis and Clark survived on pawpaws for several days that they picked along the riverbank. Those trees were cleared for agriculture. So what we want to do with the trees at Treloar is illustrate the kind of trees that were here before settlement, before we cleared the river bottom for agriculture. We hope in the future, partnering with Forest ReLeaf, St. Louis-based not-for-profit, to plant thousands of trees along the Cady Trail and along the river and in the communities between here and St. Louis. And that will not only provide shade and interest and fun for people on the Cady Trail and in those communities, but it'll provide homes for wildlife and pollinators.
Thank you, Dan. I always love hearing about the amazing work you and Magnificent Missouri is doing along the Cady Trail. Our third guest, Meredith Perkins, was born and raised in the heart of downtown St. Louis, where she discovered nature along the urban banks of the Mississippi River and in neighborhood parks. She is a passionate conservationist, forester, and arborist who has dedicated her 20-year career to connecting people to the benefits of trees. After working in state government and private urban forestry consulting across the country, Meredith is the executive director with Forest ReLeaf of Missouri, a nonprofit organization that aligns with her values and allows her to help her home community grow. Tonight, Meredith will discuss Forest ReLeaf's part in reforesting along the Cady Trail, the benefits, and the overall value of planting and stewarding trees as a way for people to take action to ensure that the legacy of our natural environment lives on for future generations. It's all yours, Meredith.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I am honored and privileged to be here tonight on Earth Day with all of these wonderful folks. And thanks so much for taking the time out of your evening. Dan really summed up our goal at the end of that video. We want to plant trees across the region, and we want to plant these trees, like Ken mentioned, in a really diverse palette of species that are going to recreate that ecosystem that was once here. Our focus is planting trees in the state park, but also along river corridors, in front yards, and even in, really urbanized highway interchanges, for example. The goal is to create a connected landscape level forest canopy where both people and nature can thrive. But what will it really take to make this happen? And that's what I want to kind of explore in the last little segment of this program. The how and the why of reforestation. How do we do this in a way that makes a landscape scale impact? And it is kind of a complicated question. Let's see. Okay, so when I started to try and break this down, what I really realized is that I think it's easiest to think of the concept from the flip side. How does deforestation make landscape scale impacts? As Lisa explained, I grew up at the confluence of two powerful rivers. I only knew this one, the Mississippi, because I could walk there from my house. So we would go to the river, and going to the river meant scavenging for cool treasure along the cobblestones and the arch grounds, watching air shows, listening to drag racers sometimes speed down the street, right? Going to the river was always an adventure, but somehow the river was always just at the edge of the excitement, a place where dirty water, industrial barges, and dead fish kind of hung out. There was no nature in this place that I knew. But I didn't really miss it because I didn't know the difference. I didn't expect to see nature here. And I don't think that I'm particularly unique in this situation. The other river I got to know was not the adjacent Missouri River that we're here to celebrate tonight, but rather the River Des Peres in South City. So this is what was my definition of a river: a highly engineered waterway, included the original river, but also served to accept the urban stormwater runoff and really overflow sewage. It smelled, it flooded, it always contained car tires and shopping carts. Though I do want to point out, for the purpose of this talk, an important update. Over the years, Great Rivers Greenway and a lot of local governments have worked to improve the river to pair, built this wonderful bridge, and are really doing amazing work to bring some natural elements into that area as well. But the fact remains that this space is not a natural landscape and not a corridor like we have along the Missouri River. That lack of interest in the nature for urban residents, combined with a lot of negative news we hear from about rivers and green spaces, right? Rivers expecting floods. We know that there's pollution, there's trash, a lot of safety issues often would be communicated when we talked about going to the river, going to a green space. It was really anything but inspiring. Not the magical stands of willows and the oxbows and the cottonwoods, the birch and everything that's portrayed in Dan and Connie's beautiful book, but instead of that wonder and awe, people were saying things like, ooh, watch out for dead bodies down there, or don't let your dog drink that. And we're getting this kind of false narrative about what a river and a landscape should look like. And so really, that's what Forest ReLeaf is aiming to change. Our mission, actually, like the Missouri Humanities, is to enrich communities. Ours is to plant trees and enrich those communities. And we look at that on a very broad scale. We focus on kind of these 4 pillars of action. First, we want to connect people to the wonder and the value of nature, especially that nature that's near to where they live, work, and play. That's why protecting and preserving places like the Missouri River Corridor is so critical, because people can see that and experience that for themselves. We also want to activate local folks to take action in changing their landscape so they can combine, all of these small scale actions to make that landscape scale big improvement that we're looking for. But in order to get people activated, we have to educate them, and we're educating all ages of folks through our tree camp that's going to be happening this summer, to a adult tree keeper course that we wrapped up this past spring. Really just helping people understand how to sustain a healthy tree canopy and planting, so that those plantings that we do make are going to be invested and grow. And lastly, we advocate ongoing conservation and reforestation at all levels across the state, whether that's protecting from development, whether that's planting in parks, whether that's celebrating what we have. The trees are such an asset, and we want people to recognize and understand the social, economic, and environmental benefits that they bring to our well-being. Last year, this picture here is of actually a group of volunteers planting along that same river to pair corridor. So my first year with Forest ReLeaf of Missouri, I was super excited to be part of a transition of that area that had been an influential part of my growing up, and to see that landscape change really made a positive impact on me to be part of that. Okay, so that was the doom and gloom. But no matter how far removed from nature society tends to start leaning, we still, thankfully, kind of hold tight to the idea that generally trees and forests are good. If you ask people, they resonate with that. Some of it's just that sort of deep down feeling that it's right. But with a little critical thinking, we can connect forests to all of those ecosystem services. I think both Ken and Dan touched on them. And if this was a regular in-person class, we could have some dialogue about how that all kind of comes together and how people connect what those services and values are. But ultimately, the forests ecologically, the trees there along the corridor are creating both. I guess they're creating all kinds of benefits, right? Both little creeks like Pickle Springs here, and the mother rivers where the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi connect. They're hosting native wildlife, warding off encroaching invasive species, reducing erosion, absorbing floodwater, shading fish habitat, feeding game, supporting migratory birds. We could go on and on. The list really checks all the boxes. And for those reasons, we're starting to see an energy and enthusiasm for reforestation swelling along the last 100 miles of the river with Magnificent Missouri. So what we're doing along the Cady Trail, and what I'm excited to kind of break down for you, is we're partnering with the Treloar Foundation, Magnificent Missouri, Missouri State Parks, and we're working to replace some of the lost riparian forests that Ken described along the trail. We know that a lot of the Cady Trail State Park was deforested for agriculture, railroad use, any number of developments. However, now there's a growing interest to rebuild some of those native ecosystems. So we're really working together to build those bricks back. And we may not be able to build all of the systems and the tiers and everything the way that it once was, because obviously things have changed. But we're going to do our best to bring that habitat back to the landscape. Over the next 2 years, we'll be planting 200 plus trees with these organizations. We've planted 50 with a kickoff. There's a list of some of the species that we planted just a few weeks ago with a number of volunteers. We actually planted 50 trees and recruited 50 volunteers, which just blew me away. So we also, in combination with this contribution on the Cady Trail State Park, just today, we delivered 15 larger 15-gallon trees to St. Vincent Elementary School. So this elementary school is just adjacent to the Dutso trailhead where we planted the trees. And the trees will be going home with students. They'll be planted on the campus there, maybe gone home with some teachers, and helping the residents extend the tree planting momentum outside of the state park and really into the community. In addition to the positive impact on nature, I think everyone can kind of figure that out from the conversations we've been having, but really this movement has a positive impact on the community. The project ideally will give residents an opportunity to take action in improving their environment. It'll bring people together for a common cause, and the trees will provide the beauty and the shade to thousands of park visitors. So why do we plant trees? We're connecting to nature through the personal experiences. We're connecting nature to the personal experiences that change the landscape and change perspective. So city people, even rural people who haven't necessarily had that connection, can develop a relationship with nature in order to value it, to protect it, and really to vote for it. So many of our partners ask and say, well, you know, why do we need to care about what's happening over there? Or why do we need those people in the city to understand what's happening in the rural communities? But the reality is we're all part of this together, and we all need to respect and appreciate these natural systems. And so by bringing people to the space and engaging, it provides that context and that commitment. And I love this quote from Richard Liu, who was a leader in The Last Child. He wrote the book, The Last Child in the Woods, and the Nature Deficit Disorder. But he says, we cannot protect something that we do not love. We cannot love what we do not know. And we cannot know what we do not see or hear or sense. And it really resonates with me as I think to my experience along the river, never really hearing a bird chirping or seeing migratory birds coming along that river corridor. If we can build that for people, I think we'll have a lot better chance at making a landscape scale improvement. So just to kind of, summarize it, the two girls in the upper right-hand corner came to our tree camp last summer, and we sent them home with serviceberry trees. So they are personally vested now in a native tree. The young professional who planted with us along a greenway has been activated and inspired to make ongoing investments in nature. The young boy watering the trees in North St. Louis City, he knows stewardship firsthand, and he will be one of our advocates for our parks and our green spaces. Finally, the three girls on the left-hand side, they each planted their very first tree with us on the Cady Trail, this last event that we hosted. So they will now have the curiosity to explore and play in nature more, as well as the dedication to continue to do their part to support it. So in order to really make that landscape scale forest impact, we need to do two things. We have to plant and nurture the trees at all scales, but we also have to plant and nurture the culture of conservation that will sustain them. So I invite all of you to join us. We will be on this mission for a number of years, and we'll be doing lots of events this fall, so watch for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm glad to see that my photo made the final cut for the PowerPoint. And just like these young girls that you just talked about, planting trees along the Katy Trail kind of got me hooked on this whole helping reforest. And I know I had a blast. So I'm really glad I was able to go out and help. Before we open questions to the audience, I have a few for our panelists. Due to time, we will start with this one. Frank Lloyd Wright once wrote, "The best friend on earth of man is the tree. When we use the tree respectfully and economically, we have one of the greatest resources of the earth. Through time, poets, writers, artists, and architects like Wright have been depicting humans' relationship to nature. Scholars from universities, philosophy, literature, and history departments are weighing in and contributing to interdisciplinary discussions on environmental problems, both globally and locally. What role do you feel the humanities can play when it comes to planting trees? How can the humanities help inspire environmental efforts?" If Dan, if you would like to take this one first.
Well, we believe, Magnificent Missouri believes that people come to conservation through all paths. And one of our greatest collaborators has been the Missouri Humanities Council. We work with conservation groups like Forest ReLeaf and Missouri State Parks, but we think the arts and music and historic preservation all bring people to conservation. And I can't think of a better example than this book that we created, a special edition of a book that has been my favorite for a long time. And I know it's one of Meredith's too, because we've talked about it. We did a special edition, a special printing of 1,500 of these books to kick off our project that Meredith just described. The Man Who Planted Trees is a French fable. It's got beautiful woodcut illustrations, and it talks about a shepherd who planted 100 acorns a day for 30 years and transformed a barren, desolate place into a beautiful, thriving, vibrant area. And this book is something that you can read in an hour, and it is motivational and inspiring. And we are using this to kick off this wonderful tree planting effort along the trail that Meredith described. So we believe in the humanities, and we believe in art and music and history and culture and many other things that bring people to causes like this one.
I'd also like to just jump in with a shameless plug, because we too believe that inviting people in through all different avenues is the best way to capture people's interest in nature. And Forest ReLeaf is hosting a concert in the trees in Creve Coeur Park at the end of the month. And we're inviting drummers and artists to come together for an art stroll. And we're really going to be exploring exactly what you suggested, sort of the interconnectedness of trees and people and how there's so many similarities between us. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. We would love to have you all join.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And we'll add one after the event to the Facebook video as well. I'm going to jump into a comment and a question from our audience. This is for Ken. Catherine Norwood did leave a comment, and she said, "Wow, that is a lot of important information. Good to know this history is being applied to new plantings. Thank you. I thought you might want to know that." And then we had a question that was very specific to flooding, if you're able to answer this one, Ken. I'm very interested in at what point the massive land use changes along the Missouri River floodplain took place. That is what it in the middle 1800s when the region was settled, or around 1900 when technology for mechanized farming, or later. Anyways, with all the changes of the 20th century, do you have any input on that?
I may answer briefly, and maybe opportunity for Dan as well, his very excellent historical perspective on these river changes through time. But I picked a slice of time. It's a very significant one for understanding the natural communities prior to major change. But I did not look further back. There's a history of change that preceded that. And then there's a rapidly accelerating history of change that expanded from that early 1800 periods. There were already towns and small cities scattered along the Missouri River. There were already land ownership patterns, and there were already farms and fields that were present even as these things were happening. It was what was bringing people, and around the time of the War of 1812, as those troubles receded, then you found waves of immigrants coming into Missouri, and you started seeing the first of those changes. The increase in transportation with steamboats, the land survey completion, and the brought more settlers into Missouri, and the land started filling up through the 1850s, 1870s. You look at the plat books from these different river counties from the 1870s, 1890s, you see that the river had largely been parceled then. And I think you would date some of the main changes that transformed the river valley to those. And you couldn't even begin to talk about this without talking about the navigation changes from the late 1870s on into the early 1900s that were done to tame and direct the river for commercial purposes and transportation purposes. And this had a huge effect on the natural systems because it made it accessible, the floodplain accessible. It made it valuable from an agricultural sense. And it changed the flooding patterns, the sedimentation patterns, and things of that nature. So I will yield there and see if maybe Dan has anything he wants to follow.
Well, that was a great synopsis, Ken. The river valley is an evolving creature. It has been through many iterations, and the example of the Katy Railroad becoming the Cady Trail is just one of those. And it's going to continue to evolve, and that's what our interest is to get people to think about good changes and bad changes that have occurred in the past, and hopefully in the future we'll opt for the good ones.
Thank you so much. We're getting a lot of questions and we're running out of time. If anyone's comfortable to answer this one, thank you all. This is fascinating and important information and restoration work. How is the agricultural community being engaged? It seems like they can participate on parts of their land and improve soil health and different field practices. Is there any engagement with your organizations directly with any of the local farmers and helping with the forest restoration?
Well, I think the reference that Meredith made to getting some of these trees out in the hands of landowners along the trail is a great first step. It's engaging the local landowners is something that we want to see happen more, and I think we've got a plan to do that and get these trees out there and establish communication with landowners adjacent to the trail where we're planting trees already.
And I would just add that the goal is really to have everyone be excited about the project. And so there's a balance to be made with agriculture and reforestation and making sure that this isn't a threatening kind of momentum, but this is something that's going to really lift all ships and be something that's going to benefit the greater community. So we're working to communicate that, and we have some outreach plans already for the summer to get to those locals and have everybody on board and excited. So far, so good.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm going to have you share your last PowerPoint screen with us. how can our viewers help with reforesting?
All right, well, I'll run through this because it is Earth Day. And I know that in this day, beyond most, people are really thinking about what we can do individually. And one of the best things that you can do, and I know it's a kind of a cliche, but plant a native tree in your yard or on your property. Every little bit counts. So if you have an opportunity to plant a tree, go for it. But the other things that you can do are to protect the dedicated funds. Missouri Department of Conservation, Missouri State Parks, those are all funded at the luxury of our state taxes and our legislature. So let people know that you value these resources and want to see that continued. Volunteer, donate Forest ReLeaf, Magnificent Missouri, or other nonprofits to ensure trees are planted where they're needed most. We really focus on strategically planting trees for the right reasons, the right tree, the right place, and the right reasons. That might be to beautify a neighborhood, reduce energy costs, or to sustain a riparian zone. So lots of great reasons to do that. And then join your local advisory groups, your local committees that can kind of join together. It is all these small scale networks that are starting to push out and congeal together to make this effort. So if you've got some friends together, or if you can contribute to a local group, that's a great way to get involved. And then, as we talked about, there are these remnant forests. There are these areas that are in place that are preserved landscapes, and making sure that there are policies in place to protect those areas and conserve them is really helping do some of the heavy lifting, so we don't have to continue planting at this, exponential rate. So those are the few that came off the top of my head. Maybe gentlemen want to add any others to that list.
I think that one thing that we can always use help with is removing bush honeysuckle. So we partner every year with state parks, and we have honeysuckle hacks in the spring and the fall. So please visit our website and find out when those are. And we fight that battle, and we're making some progress. We need your help.
Dan, you actually answered a question that somebody had about in areas of state parks, along highways and conservation areas, where we see invasive trees and bushes. Are we removing those invasive plants? So thank you. You kind of answered that question without asking. Ken, is there anything you would like to add before we conclude?
If I were to touch on the native or invasive species questions and points, I would just contribute to that as well, as seeing those as being one of the significant challenges to whether it's preserving our native remnant examples of forest, our recovering examples of forest, or those areas that we might be planting. It certainly is one of the biggest challenges, and I think all of the environmental organizations, all of the professional resource managers and different agencies are all challenged to try and deal with the scope and magnitude of this as we look to our forests of the future.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone that tuned in tonight. Thanks to our guest presenters, Dan, Ken, and Meredith. The presentation will be available to view on our website and on Facebook. So there's a lot of great information here in such a short amount of time. So feel free to rewatch, do your studying, feel free to share. We would love to hear your thoughts on tonight's program. Link to the survey will show in the browser when the webinar ends. If you would like to learn more about our programs or would like to consider becoming one of our members, please visit mohumanities.org. Thank you so much for spending Earth Day with us. I hope tonight's program has inspired you to get out and plant some trees. Thank you and good night, everyone. Thank you again, Dan, Ken, and Meredith.